I want to welcome you, everyone, to this lecture. My name is Bill Saunders. I'm the director of the Program in Human Rights at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. The Institute for Human Ecology is an academic institute committed to multidisciplinary reflection on human flourishing in light of Catholic social thought. You can learn more about the IHE at the website, which is ihe.catholic.edu. As I mentioned, tonight's lecture is one part of the human rights program. Another part is the Master of Arts in Human Rights, which we have started at Catholic University. It's an innovative, one-of-its-kind program. It's an interdisciplinary program that looks at the question of human rights from philosophical, legal, political theory, and theological perspectives, aiming to give a well-rounded understanding of what the term means in light of Catholic teaching about the dignity of the human person and the common good. You can learn more about the Master of Arts in Human Rights at the webpage M.A, as in Master of Arts, mahumanrights.com. One word, mahumanrights.com. At that webpage, you can also find out how to contact me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. You can just email me a question. If you happen to be a college age person or somebody about to graduate or somebody who has graduated is looking for a graduate program that would give you a deep and an unusual insight into this question of human rights, which would equip you to go out into the world of humanitarian work or human rights work or political work or non-governmental work, please get in touch with us. I'd be glad to be in touch with you. So tonight, Professor Keown, I think, is about to join us. Our speaker, John Keown. Welcome, Professor. I'm happy to say that at the Program for Human Rights, my program for human rights, we have an advisory board, and one of the distinguished members of our advisory board is Professor Keown. Dr. John Keown is the Rose Kennedy Professor of Christian Ethics in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. He graduated in law from Cambridge University and received a doctorate in law from Oxford University. He was the first holder of a lectureship in the law and ethics of medicine at Cambridge University, where he was elected to a fellowship at Queen's College and later a senior research fellowship at Churchill College. He's published widely in the law and ethics of medicine, specializing in issues at the beginning and end of life. The second and heavily revised edition of his acclaimed book, Euthanasia, Ethics and Public Policy, An Argument Against Legislation, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And I can tell you, having read the book from cover to cover as a pre-publication reviewer, it is both magisterial and encyclopedic. I can't imagine you need any other resource to delve into questions surrounding euthanasia and public policy. His research has been cited by distinguished bodies worldwide, including the United States Supreme Court, the Law Lords, the House of Commons, the House of Lords Select Committee on Medical Ethics, and the Australian Senate. In 2015, he received one of the highest awards in academia when he was made a Doctor of Civil Law by the University of Oxford in recognition of his contribution to law and bioethics. I've known Professor Keown for 20 years. He is a rigorous thinker and a clear and precise writer and speaker. Tonight he will speak to us about the Pope and the bomb, the ethics of nuclear deterrence. At the end, you'll be able to ask questions. Professor Keown.
Well, Thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And may I commend you for your sterling work in heading up that very exciting program, the MA in Human Rights. So this evening, what I'd like to do is share with you and the audience a PowerPoint presentation that I put together on this very controversial and very important question of the ethics of nuclear deterrence, and very appropriate that perhaps I'm talking on this subject on Veterans Day or Remembrance Day, as it is back in England. So let me share with you the PowerPoint that I've prepared. The Pope and the Bomb: The Ethics of Nuclear Deterrence. So first of all, I'd like to begin with a brief outline of the talk. I'll start by speaking to two basic ethical principles relating to war: the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality. These are at the heart of the just war tradition. I'll then, as it were, apply those to the ethics of the conventional obliteration bombing of cities, drawing on the example of the Allied bombing of German cities in the Second World War. We'll then turn to the ethics of the nuclear bombing of cities, in particular Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before turning to the question of the ethics of nuclear deterrence. We'll start with the important document, The Challenge of Peace, written by the US Catholic bishops in 1983. And then we'll turn to Pope Francis's opposition to the possession of nuclear weapons, and we'll explore the basis of his opposition to the use and possession of nuclear weapons. And we'll conclude by suggesting that there is a clearer and more coherent ethical case against nuclear deterrence than the Holy Father has hitherto adopted. So that is an outline of my presentation. So let's start, first of all, with the two basic ethical principles, the principle of distinction and proportionality. And I will, as it were, quote the principles as stated by the Catholic bishops in their 1983 statement. So the first, the principle of distinction, or sometimes called the principle of discrimination, says it's never permitted to direct nuclear or conventional weapons to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their populations. The intentional killing of innocent civilians or non-combatants is always wrong. So that's a key principle of the just war tradition, which rules out the intentional killing of innocent civilians or non-combatants. And then the principle of proportionality, important. Even defensive response to unjust attack can cause destruction which violates the principle of proportionality, going far beyond the limits of legitimate defense. This judgment is particularly important when assessing planned use of nuclear weapons. No defensive strategy, nuclear or conventional, which exceeds the limits of proportionality is morally permissible, said the bishops. So whereas the first principle prohibits the intentional killing of non-combatants, the second principle says, well, even if it's not your intention to kill innocent civilians, nevertheless, any destruction of life which is foreseen must nevertheless be proportionate. So sometimes this is called collateral damage, peoples whose deaths are foreseen but not intended. The principle of proportionality says you must also be able to justify these loss of life by the principle of proportionality. How important is your military objective? Is it worth the cost, or is there any alternative way of securing that military objective? So those are two key principles, distinction and proportionality. Now let's apply them to the conventional obliteration bombing of cities. And here we start with the classic piece Father John Ford wrote in Theological Studies in 1944. It's as relevant today as it was when he wrote it, called The Morality of Obliteration Bombing, which was sadly taking place during the Second World War. What did he mean by obliteration bombing? Well, the strategic bombing by means of incendiaries and explosives of industrial centres of population in which the target to be wiped out is not a definite factory, bridge or similar object, but a large area of a whole city comprising 1/3 to 2/3 of its whole built-up area, and including by design the residential districts of working men and their families. Now, some people justified the wholesale bombing of German cities, including civilian areas, on the basis that the distinction between combatants and non-combatants was old-fashioned, was out of date in the context of modern warfare. Well, Father Ford rejected that. He stood by this traditional distinction between combatants and non-combatants. He said the distinction remained valid, even if sometimes it was difficult to draw the line. Who's a combatant? Who's an innocent civilian? This is not so much, he said, because of the increase in civilian involvement in war, but because the power of the military to attract civilians had increased exponentially. We were able now to bomb civilian cities in ways that we couldn't before the development of the aeroplane. So he stood by the important distinction. He said the burden of proof is on those who would justify the killing of civilians. And he said there's a long list of people who are clearly non-combatants. And they included farmers, piano tuners, and I'm delighted to say, professors. So Father Ford said non-combatants comprise most of the total civilian population. He calculated around 3/4 of people in the United States were non-combatants on any measure. And he concluded that the Allied intent when they were bombing cities like Dresden and Hamburg was in fact to kill non-combatants. Terrorizing civilians was part of their bombing strategy. It's impossible, he wrote, to make civilian terrorization or the undermining of civilian morale an object of bombing without having a direct intent to injure and kill civilians. The Allied leaders weren't thinking in terms of double effect. They weren't thinking the killing of these civilians is a merely foreseen side effect of our bombing of military targets. They were our aim. We were aiming to kill them. They were acting out of revenge. So a clear breach, said Father Ford, of the principle of discrimination. It was the deliberate killing of non-combatants. Additionally, the bombing breached the second principle of proportionality. It was disproportionate. Even if the deaths of non-combatants were not intended, he said, they were nevertheless disproportionate. The good, the aim of shortening the war by terrorizing the civilians was speculative, but the cost to those many thousands of civilians was certain and grave, so it was completely disproportionate. Was the bombing of industrial centres even effective, he questioned. And he noted that Germany's blitz against cities like London served only to strengthen British resolve. So it was useless, it was futile. So Father Ford's conclusion about the obliteration bombing of the German cities like Dresden and Hamburg was, it was immoral because it involved the intentional killing of non-combatants, it was disproportionate, and it set an appalling example to other countries. Other countries were looking to the United States and to Great Britain to set a moral example. And sadly, we were falling below the standard of morality which the just war tradition had traditionally laid down. What now about the ethics of the nuclear bombing of cities? Well, here, of course, we turn to the situation in Japan at the end of the Second World War. And interestingly, we could start with another article by Father Ford. This was an essay called The Hydrogen Bombing of Cities that he wrote several years later, in 1960. And he argued that dropping nuclear bombs on cities like Moscow or New York would breach the principle of discrimination and proportionality. Terror bombing means killing and maiming innocent non-combatants in order to frighten the resistance out of those who survive. We did this, he wrote, in Germany. If we do not intend to do it again, why are we stockpiling large quantities of high megaton H-bombs? It is clear that the actual intent will be to win the war by wiping out everything in sight. This was not, he said, like dropping a nuclear bomb on an enemy fleet at sea, when some innocent civilians might be on board the enemy ships. That theoretically might be justifiable. But that's not what we're talking about when you're aiming nuclear bombs at whole cities populated with civilians. If nuclear warfare, he wrote, were thought morally legitimate, it would mean the practical abandonment of any distinction between innocent non-combatants and guilty aggressors, that fundamental distinction which the Catholic Church has taught for centuries, and the gains made by Christianity down through the centuries in suppressing the barbarities of war would be lost. Now we can turn to Professor Elizabeth Anscombe, one of the greatest Catholic philosophers of the 20th century, who famously wrote an article called Mr. Truman's Degree in 1956, in which she opposed the awarding of an honorary degree to President Truman by the University of Oxford. She opposed it because he had authorized the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She wrote in her essay, "With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we are not confronted with a borderline case. In the bombing of these cities, it was certainly decided to kill the innocent as a means to an end. And a very large number of them, all at once, without warning, without the interstices of escape or the chance to take shelter, which existed even in the area bombings of the German cities." She went on, "Choosing to kill the innocent as a means to your ends is always murder." So she opposed the awarding of a degree. She was outvoted, and President Truman was awarded his honorary DCL in 1956. Yet, despite the opposition of leading moralists like Father Ford and Professor Anscombe, there is to this day a debate among Catholic moralists about whether the use of those nuclear bombs was justified or not. So on the one hand, you might find Father Wilson Miss Campbell in his book, The Most Controversial Decision, in which he argues that President Truman was forced by necessity into this moral evil. You'll find a response to his book by Professor Christopher Tollefson in the pages of the Public Discourse in 2011. And I'd like to quote just one or two brief passages from Professor Tollefson's response. He asks, was it morally defensible for Truman to decide to drop those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Professor Tollefson replies, by the standards of what philosophers call common morality, the tradition of common morality, the answer is clearly in the negative. Common morality is that part of morality that has been articulated, developed, and promulgated by the Judeo-Christian tradition, but which can also be known by natural reason. By well before the 20th century, common morality had coalesced about a principle of just war, that those who pose no threat are absolutely not to be intentionally targeted or killed. This principle was acknowledged, but certainly not introduced, by the Second Vatican Council in its document Gaudium et Spes, and he quotes, "Every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation," unquote. So, continued Professor Tollefson, common morality and at least the Catholic Church's magisterial teaching on the matter agree that non-combatants should never be intentionally targeted for death. And never, he added, means never. He goes on, Father Miss Campbell writes of Truman, within the privacy of his own heart and soul, it's likely that Truman understood he had been forced by necessity to enter into evil, and so indeed he had. But Professor Tollefson replies to this, but the idea of being faced with and forced by necessity into doing evil is no part of common morality. It is always possible to refrain from an action whose intention would be contrary to a human good. And the deliberate killing of the innocent elderly and the sick women and children is precisely such an action, always and deeply contrary to the good of human life, always and everywhere to be avoided in one's choices and actions. And Professor Tollefson goes on, If one can be forced by necessity into killing the innocents on a grand scale for the great good of the state, then why cannot one be forced into such killing on a small scale for the sake of one's career, education, mental well-being, or family stability? The pro-life view identifies a universal moral norm, he writes, as underwriting its commitment to the unborn. All innocent human beings are to be held absolutely immune from intentionally inflicted harm or death. Snip that thread in the ethics of war, Tollefson writes, and the entire pro-life garment, covering the unborn, the disabled, and the elderly, begins to unravel. More recently, Mr. George Weigel, recently in First Things, also concluded controversially that President Truman's decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the correct choice. And I replied to Mr. Weigel along the lines of Professor Tollefson's response to Professor Miss Campbell, that intentionally killing the innocent is always and everywhere immoral. So it's interesting that this debate continues even to this day among Catholic moralists. Now let's turn to the ethics of nuclear deterrence, and we'll go back to the Catholic bishops' document, The Challenge of Peace in 1983. The question we're addressing is essentially this: is it ethical to intend and threaten to nuke one or all of another country's cities if that other country were to nuke one or all of ours? Well, let's turn to the answer to that question given by the Catholic bishops in 1983. They wrote that in current conditions, deterrence based on balance, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament, may still be judged morally acceptable. Nonetheless, in order to ensure peace, it's indispensable not to be satisfied with this minimum, which is always susceptible to the real danger of explosion. And they were quoting Pope St. John Paul II in a message to the United Nations in 1982. They went on that no use of nuclear weapons, which would violate the principle of discrimination or proportionality, may be intended in a strategy of deterrence. The moral demands of Catholic teaching require resolute willingness not to intend or to do moral evil, even to save our own lives or the lives of those we love. Deterrence is not an adequate strategy as a long-term basis for peace. It's a transitional strategy, justifiable only in conjunction with resolute determination to pursue arms control and disarmament. We are convinced that the fundamental principle on which our present peace depends must be replaced by another, which declares true and solid peace of nations consists not in equality of arms, but in mutual trust alone. So the US bishops condoned nuclear deterrence, at least as a step on the way to progressive disarmament. They thought it may be judged morally acceptable. Now we may contrast that position with that of Pope Francis, who has spoken repeatedly against the use and possession of nuclear weapons. So let's summarize now what Pope Francis's position is. He's the first pope to condemn not only the use but also the possession of nuclear weapons. It's fair to say opposition to nuclear deterrence has been a theme of his pontificate. In April 2015, Time magazine noted his opposition to nuclear weapons was one of his top diplomatic priorities. It quoted Archbishop Auser, then the Holy See's ambassador to the UN, who observed, Pope Francis has recently pushed the moral argument against nuclear weapons to a new level, not only against their use, but also against their possession, adding, today there is no more argument, not even the argument of deterrence used during the Cold War, that could minimally morally justify the possession of nuclear weapons. The peace of a sort that is supposed to justify nuclear deterrence is specious and illusory. In November 19, he visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He declared his deep conviction that the use of atomic energy for purposes of war is today more than ever a crime not only against the dignity of human beings, but against any possible future for our common home, and that the use of atomic weapons for purposes of war is immoral, just as the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral. In Nagasaki, he noted that millions of children and families lived in inhumane conditions, and he bewailed the money squandered and the fortunes made through the manufacture, upgrading, maintenance, and sale of ever more destructive weapons as an affront crying out to heaven. In Fratelli Tutti, he stressed the importance of recalling Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for we could not move forward without remembering the past. And he reiterated that the ultimate goal of eliminating nuclear weapons was a moral and humanitarian imperative. Archbishop Tomasi, one of the Holy Father's closest advisors on the issue, described in a speech here at Georgetown in January the Pope's opposition to the use and possession of nuclear weapons as unambiguous. However, is the Pope's position unambiguous? With respect, it isn't. It's not clear whether it's based on principle or on consequences. Does the Holy Father oppose nuclear weapons because, for example, of the large amounts of money spent on them and maintaining them? Or does he regard their possession as immoral in and of itself? If he thinks their possession is immoral, why does he speak of disarmament as a future goal as opposed to an immediate requirement? So it seems to me that there are ambiguities, serious ambiguities, in the Holy Father's position on nuclear weapons. It's not clear whether his position is a principled objection or not. So it seems to me what we need is a clearer position for the Holy Father to adopt, a position that's clearer, that's more coherent and more convincing than the one he's actually articulated so far. So what might that look like? Well, I think it might look something like this, based on those fundamental principles we started off with. So we saw the principle of discrimination is based on the notion that it's morally wrong intentionally to kill the innocent, to kill non-combatants. That being the case, it's also morally wrong to intend, even conditionally, to kill the innocent. That is to say, it's equally wrong to form the intention to kill an innocent person if certain circumstances materialize. So, for example, if Russia nukes New York, we will nuke Moscow. So that's conditional intention. If something happens, we will kill all the civilians in Moscow. And that is morally wrong. And if that's morally wrong, then policies of nuclear deterrence based on a conditional intention to kill the innocent are also morally wrong. So it seems to me this is a much clearer and more coherent ethical basis on which to oppose the possession of nuclear weapons, rather than, for example, the cost of constructing and maintaining them. One could add, not only does the possession of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence policies of the current age fall foul of the principle of discrimination, it seems to me one also has to ask whether the use of nuclear weapons could ever satisfy the principle of proportionality. The US bishops in their documents accepted that the use of nuclear weapons, even in a limited, so-called limited nuclear war, and even if aimed only at military facilities, would be devastating to the country as a whole. And this is the sort of argument, the argument that nuclear deterrence is wrong because it's based on a conditional intent to kill non-combatants, that is very persuasively advanced in the classic book, Nuclear Deterrence, Morality and Realism, written by three very eminent Catholic philosophers, John Finnis, Joseph Boyle, and Germaine Grisey. So in conclusion, it seems to me that nuclear deterrence seems impossible to reconcile with the ethical principles of distinction and of proportionality. Now, of course, that raises grave questions. Where should we go from here? What should we do in the light of that moral argument? And perhaps we can pick that question up in Q&A. But for now, I think I'll leave you with that rather sobering conclusion.
Oh, thank you, Professor Keown. One thing I wanted to, let's go to where you left it, which is what is a country supposed to do?
Well, the answer is that the current policies of countries like the United States, Britain, and France is based on the conditional intention to kill innocent civilians, city swapping, and final retaliation. And therefore, that policy must be abandoned immediately because it's intrinsically immoral. So I think what we're talking about here, and this is certainly the policy advocated by Finnis, Boyle, and Grise, is nuclear disarmament, immediate nuclear disarmament.
Well, so you open the border to your enemies to destroy you and to destroy innocent women, children, old people, etc.?
Well, two answers to that. One is whatever the result of doing it doesn't matter, in the sense that if you're doing something that's wrong, you must stop doing that something that's wrong, regardless of the consequences. So if the bombing of Hiroshima was wrong, you must not do that, even if it means that winning the war would have cost many, many more lives, both American and Japanese. So the key thing is to stop doing what's immoral. And the consequences might be very profound. There's no question about that. Whether it would result in foreign powers destroying the United States, I think that's rather unlikely, because why would a foreign power want to destroy the United States? What possible benefit would it give to start nuking the United States and maybe threatening its own safety through any environmental hazards that might result? So I don't think it automatically follows that unilateral disarmament would result in the destruction of the country. But there's no question that it would place powers with nuclear weapons in a very strong political position, a military position, vis-a-vis countries like the United States and the United Kingdom.
Well, a country might not want to destroy the United States, but it might want to control the United States. And it might say to the United States that now that you don't have nuclear weapons and we do, you will work for us and you will supply for us, or we will nuke whatever city we decide on whatever day.
Yep.
Which will, okay. And those consequences have to be accepted because it's morally impermissible to possess nuclear weapons?
Well, one has to, let's assume the consequences would be very profound and very grave. That's no argument at all for maintaining a nuclear deterrence. If maintaining a nuclear deterrence is intrinsically moral, one can't do it, full stop.
Well, you know, some politicians in the past, I think, thought of a creative way out of the dilemma that at least I'm asking you about, which is, do you remember under President Reagan, what was sometimes called Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a ring, as I understand it, a ring of missiles that would destroy nuclear weapons before they could penetrate your airspace, but would not necessitate, I don't think, the possession of nuclear weapons yourself. Does that sound acceptable?
Yeah, well, how long would it take to develop that defense shield? You see, the problem with nuclear deterrence, if it's immoral, is you must stop it right now. You can't wait until you've devised some kind of defense shield against incoming nuclear weapons.
Well, do you think that's why the bishop said it was transitional, because they wanted to get to a point where we weren't subject to the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union?
I think the bishops, with respect, made two mistakes in their reasoning, it seems to me. One is that they, I think, probably misunderstood Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II said nuclear deterrence may be justifiable, but he didn't say it was justifiable. He may just have been leaving the question open. And secondly, I think the bishops were misled by the advice from government officials that the policy of the United States was not to target civilians as such. So I think the bishops thought, well, that's fine, because then there's no breach of the principle of discrimination. But the reality is these weapons are aimed at everybody in Russian cities. So they don't have to be targeted at civilians as such. They could be targeted at Russian military bases, but nevertheless intended to kill everybody in the city. And that breaches the principle of discrimination. So I think that's where the bishops fell down. They didn't see clear-sightedly that the policies of NATO countries are based on, the nuclear powers, are based on a conditional intent to kill innocent civilians, and therefore are intrinsically immoral.
Here's a question from for you from Kevin Flannery from Creighton. When challenge to peace says that also the defensive use says that also the defensive use nuclear weapons can be immoral. The defensive use of nuclear weapons can be immoral. Is it so clear that it understands such use as not intentional? Thomas Aquinas says that public self-defense can be moral or immoral and also intended. So when challenge of peace says that the defensive use of nuclear weapons can also be immoral, is it so clear that it understands such use as not intentional?
I'm not sure I entirely follow the question, but I think even if one is using nuclear weapons in defense, if they're targeted, if they're intended to kill non-combatants, then that use is immoral. And a policy which conditionally intends to use them in that way is immoral. And I don't think there's any question that the current policies of nuclear deterrence are based on a conditional intention to kill non-combatants and are therefore immoral.
Well, here's another question. Arguments for nuclear disarmament / deterrence and the protection of cultural heritage often go hand in hand. Can more international attention and legal protection create more unambiguous future moves?
Well, there's always room for more international action in ridding the world of nuclear weapons, and that's a good thing. We've seen, it seems to me, precious little progress on that since even 1983, but since the Bishop's statement. So by all means, you know, if countries take steps to disarm, to rid the world of these dreadful weapons, so much the better. But the point is, it can't be tolerated as a justifiable step towards that, because if it's intrinsically immoral, it must be, as it were, resiled from immediately.
So are nuclear weapons different from any other kind of weapons?
In their capacity for immense destruction, obviously, yes.
But what I mean by the question is, if I understand your argument, the mere possession of nuclear weapons is wrong, morally unacceptable. So are other kinds of destructive weapons, such as, I don't know, bombs that are not nuclear, but you know, there are bombs that can do incredible devastation that are conventional bombs. Are they, is the possession of them immoral?
There's not sort of, the morality follows the intent rather than the implement. So one could say, and this is why I wanted to talk about Dresden and Hamburg as well as about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the same principle. It's the same moral principle that applies. Nuclear weapons are vastly more destructive, but one can murder innocent people with conventional bombs too. So it's not in a sense as if nuclear weapons have raised a new moral question. It's an old question in new clothes. And the Judeo-Christian tradition, the just war tradition, has said one may never intend to kill non-combatants, whether with conventional bombs or with nuclear bombs. So it's the intent behind them that's key, and it's clear that the intent behind our having the nuclear weapons is to wipe out non-combatants, not just military forces, not just.
What if you had nuclear
aggressors.
weapons that you intended only to drop on an adversary's fleet? I mean, you mentioned that in your own talk.
Yeah, that's right. You can
possession would not be immoral.
Can imagine scenarios where you have a nuclear weapon to deflect an asteroid that's about to hit the Earth. Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Well, so possession in and of itself is not immoral.
No.
It's only possession with intent to kill innocent people.
Yes. Now, it may be that there would be an argument against building and maintaining nuclear weapons for all sorts of other reasons, namely the vast expense. Why would you want to construct such a powerful weapon? And reasons that they may fall into the hands of people who would abuse them, and it may signal to other countries, hey, they say they're just going to use their weapons against asteroids, but we don't believe them, so we're going to build one too. So there are all sorts of reasons why it might be wrong to produce nuclear weapons, even if you never intended to use them to murder innocent people.
So here's a question from a student. For those nations without nuclear weapons, what might be an effective, practical, and moral form of deterrence? Perhaps greater economic ties and diplomacy and shared objectives between nations could help prevent nuclear conflagration from breaking out, ? So what might be an effective form of deterrence?
Well, deterrence, I take it the question means of not so much deterring nuclear attack from a nuclear armed country, but one way of actually eliminating these weapons. I think countries without nuclear weapons shouldn't obtain them, shouldn't support other countries having them, should do everything possible to discourage other countries from having them. So there's a treaty against the possession of nuclear weapons that now 50 countries have signed. It will come into effect, I think, in February. It's a UN treaty. So the more countries who sign up to that, the better, because that is setting a very good moral example. So those countries that don't have them can help set a moral example for the rest of the world and encourage those countries that do have them to get rid of them.
Here's another question. To what extent is the killing of non-combatants an inevitable consequence of war, even if one does not intend to kill non-combatants or at any point? And to what extent are nuclear weapons so powerful that even if one does not intend to kill non-combatants, one probably will do so? How would this inevitability of killing non-combatants, even unintentionally, affect the argument?
Well, it seems to me, offend the principle of proportionality. So even if one's intention was not to kill non-combatants, then the reality would be that you'd be wiping them out wholesale. And the principle of proportionality would, I think, object to that. So why on earth would you use a nuclear weapon if it wasn't your intent to wipe out non-combatants? Why wouldn't you use a conventional weapon aimed at a military installation? So their enormous and awful power is such that they'd be a perfect illustration of the disproportionate use of force, it seems to me. So I find it very difficult to see any justification, unless it were that hypothetical scenario where you're using once against an enemy fleet which is isolated, or an enemy army on a desert island of discrete territory with no population, civilian population around it. Otherwise, the argument from disproportionality, it seems to me, is going to be very powerful.
Here's another question. With the prospect of immediate disarmament rather unrealistic, are there intermediate steps aimed towards nuclear disarmament which would be morally legitimate? Or is the traditional stepping stones, quote, stepping stones of approach morally compromised from your point of view?
Well, in a world where I think the questioner's right. It is unrealistic to expect the United States and Russia and Britain and France unilaterally to disarm, even though that's what they ought to do. So one is left with a situation where one has to say, well, what's the next best thing we can do? If we can push multilateral disarmament as a means of ridding ourselves of these weapons, well, let's try and do that. It's still wrong for these countries to have them, but we shouldn't, as it were, just throw our hands in the air and say, well, if they won't do the right thing, there's nothing we can do. We should try and encourage them in other ways to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And it may be that multilateral treaties and diplomacy is the way to go.
Another question, as a theoretical matter, would it be permissible for a country to have a nuclear arsenal to deter aggression if the country had a secret policy not to use the weapons if deterrence failed?
Well, one could argue, sometimes people have argued, that it's not wrong to have nuclear weapons if you have no intention of ever using them. And that would meet the objection that the possession of the weapons breaches the principle of discrimination, because you'd say, I have no intention of ever using them to kill innocent civilians. So that would, as it were, get you around the first objection. But there are all sorts of problems with that. One is, it's just so unrealistic. That's not the reality. That's not the world we live in. The countries that have them do intend to use them. They're very open about that. So to suggest that, you know, what if someone had them but didn't intend to use them is I think, fanciful. But second, also, I think there are objections to having them because you would encourage other people, you would encourage other countries to create them as well, because you've got them. And so I think there'd be a very good moral argument against not having them, even if you never intended to use them.
Okay, here's one more. This will be our last question, John. It seems the discussion of nuclear weapons goes to extremes as if time doesn't matter, and a perfect result, total disarmament, is achievable. Are there obvious policies that can be pursued and implemented by reducing the vast nuclear arsenal of the US and the placement of the remaining weapons close to Russia or China? And relatedly, reducing the US military presence around the world and its continual efforts at regime change? Wouldn't positive action in these areas decrease tensions and decrease the threat of nuclear war?
Well, I think it's always good to decrease tensions and improve diplomatic relations. Clearly it is. But that's not really going to get us around the central moral objection to having nuclear weapons and the danger of them being used either deliberately or accidentally. So by all means, let's reduce international tensions. Let's promote international harmony. But that's very much a second best, if you like, to the right course, which is for each country to disarm, to get rid of these dreadful weapons, because it's immoral to have them with the intent of using them even conditionally.
Well, thank you, Professor. You've given, I'm sure you've given the audience something to think about and to probably engage you in conversation with when they run into you around Washington, D.C. or at cocktail parties, or perhaps when you speak to me or my students again. But we thank you. It's an important issue, and it certainly goes to the basis of any thinking about human rights. Does this kind of weaponry cross a line that's just unacceptable given the dignity of each human person?
Right.
So,
and could I just add, if I may, so thanks again for this opportunity to speak to you and your class and people out there. And I make no claim to originality here. I must admit that I've been deeply impressed, obviously, by the classic book by Finis, Boyle and Griset, and by the work of people like Professor Tollefson. So I hope the audience also takes advantage of those resources. And at the end of my slideshow, which I'll be happy to give you so you can post, I have a list of sources that people might find useful and stimulating.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the audience for turning in, and we'll see you next time.